In this video, I'm going to show you how to go from this to this to this. Hello my friend, my name is Matt and I make music under the name Best Friends Club, and in this video I'm going to show you how you can extract a vocal from a full recording so that you can take a perfectly isolated vocal and create a remix around it. And not just that, how you can then remove that from that entire instrumental and beat that you've created and replace it with your own hook so that you can also create an original piece of music that you can actually release to the world. I've been finding this to be a pretty clever production workflow since, for one, you get two finished pieces of music. You can have a nicely polished remix that sounds nice and clean since you have that cleanly isolated vocal track. And then you can also, like I mentioned, remove that vocal and create a original piece of music that you can release without any kind of copyright issues or anything like that. So what's also interesting about this is I've noticed that as you're creating your own instrumental and beat around that vocal stem, I've honestly been making music that maybe I wouldn't have made if I weren't using that vocal track as a reference along the songwriting process, if I was just starting an instrumental or a beat from scratch. In this example, we'll be using the song Billie Jean by Michael Jackson. In this particular video tutorial, we'll be using a cover version from the YouTuber JFlaw Music. However, when I was originally creating this, I actually used the actual vocal stem that I extracted from Billie Jean's Michael Jackson, like the original recording. If you want to hear that remix that I did with Michael Jackson's voice, there will be a link to it in the description below. And if you want to hear the original song that I used, once I removed Michael's voice from my remix, there'll be a link to that below as well, because I actually ended up releasing that on Spotify and all that kind of good stuff. So I'm pretty excited about this whole process and how I was able to create a remix and then actually release an original song, and that's exactly what I want to show you how to do today in this video. So in this tutorial, we'll be using two main tools. One is Ableton Live as our digital audio workstation, but you can follow along with more or less any DAW if you'd like. And the second important tool is LALAL.AI, which we'll be using to extract the vocal stem so that we have a nice, clean vocal stem to use while building our remix and our instrumental and our beat around it. If you'd like to extract or isolate stems yourself, visit LALAL.AI or the link in the description below. And with that said, let's jump right into this. Alright, so the very first thing that we're going to do is we're going to extract the vocals from the original file. In this example for the tutorial, we're going to be using a cover version of the song, but when I was actually doing this, I used the original song, which was really awesome to do. And we did it using LALAL.AI. So what we'll do is just head over to LALAL.AI, and all we need to do is grab the audio file and drag it over into this kind of little drop area here. And usually while this is kind of doing its thing, doing the magic, what I will normally do when I'm doing a remix is head over to another tab and then type in the name of the song and just type in key. And this way we can find out, okay, Billie Jean is in the key of F sharp minor. And this will just make things a little bit easier when we are building all the melodic content around the song. So once it is done uploading and processing over here on LALAL.AI, the next step is to just have a listen to the previews that they give us, just to make sure that everything is sounding all right. So let's go ahead and take a listen to the vocal.
Don't go around breaking young girls' heart. Be careful what to do, cause the light becomes so true, yeah.
All right, sounding pretty good. Let's go ahead and then listen to the instrumental on its own. And then all together. Nice, so that is good for me. As you can see, we can also extract individual other elements if we'd like to, but for building remixes, I like starting with the vocal, because what we can then do is then make sure that all the instruments around the vocal are unique. So then when we take away that vocal, we can turn it into an original song. So we're going to go ahead and press process the entire file. So once it's done splitting the actual file, it'll give you the vocal track and the instrumental track. You can download them individually if you'd like to, but I'd recommend pressing download all so that you have the vocal and the instrumental track. It'll make it a little bit easier when we are time stretching the vocal track to fit in with the tempo of our song, which is what we're going to do next. So the next step would be to press download all, and then we'll load those files over into our DAW. Alright, so now that we're in Ableton Live, what I'd recommend doing is grabbing the instrumental and putting it on one track, and then grabbing the vocal track and then putting it on another track here, and then just lining them up so they're starting at the same position. So now what we're going to do is we need to find the one of where the music starts, the first of the bar, and the easiest way to do that is to use the instrumental as a guide, since there's usually like a kick drum that's going to start the one of the beat, and it just makes it a lot easier compared to when you doing it with vocals. So let's go ahead and look for that. We're going to kind of be looking for the chorus. That's the main thing that I was using in this remix. So let's go ahead and start investigating here.
'Cause life becomes so true, yeah.
It's definitely about around here. So what we do is we'll just zoom in a bit. And we can see it's around here. And again, like if we were listening to the vocal on its own, it'd be harder to tell where that one is. There's like that and then the vocal starts almost where the snare hits. So if you were trying to just follow the vocal as a guide, it can get a little hairy. So the idea is to zoom in a bunch on the instrumental track, and you're looking for the beginning of the transient, which is somewhere around here. See, it's almost like where the thick part starts. So we just make a cut right there. And then the idea is, since we're using the instrumental as a guide, we'll go ahead and at the same point on the vocal spot, we'll also make a cut there. And then we'll delete everything from the left for each. And then we'll zoom back out. And then what we're going to do is grab each, make it start on like the first of one of these bars in Ableton, and let's have a listen. Cool, that sounds good. But if we listen with the metronome on, the tempo of the song right now is 126. Let's have a listen to that together. Brutal, as you can hear. So there's a couple different ways to do it. If you want to check out our full vocal prep guide, there'll be a link to it above as well as in the description below. But one of the ways that we can do it in this example, we're going to consolidate each one of these tracks. So the one is starting on each of these. And then what we can do is then click warp on and off. And then what we're going to do is zoom in a bit, and we're going to adjust the BPM here. And what we're trying to get to is we're trying to align up all of these main transients, these kick and snare hits, so that they are in their correct place. So we'll go ahead and keep adjusting that. No. So it looks like we got to drag it out a bit. Maybe about there. Let's hear that. So if you can see now, all these transient hits are all landing on like one of these main bars. So I have a feeling that's going to sound good. What we'll do is we'll turn off the vocal track so we just hear the instrumental as a guide. Cool, so you can hear it's quite on there, and since we now know that it's 117, if we go down to the vocal track, we can go ahead and click warp off and on, just something I like to do to make sure that it's set up nicely. And we can just type in 117 instead of having to do it ourselves. And now if we listen to the vocal track and the instrumental track with the metronome, everything should be on time. Cool, so that's definitely one of the ways to do it. And then generally at this point, what I would do is click into the vocal. I would then usually change this to complex, just changing the warping algorithm so it's a little bit more pleasant. When working with the cover song version of this, I ended up deciding to switch it to complex pro, and then kind of played with the formants in the envelope just a little bit. And then I had to pitch it up about 5 semitones as well, just because I believe the cover version was recorded in a slightly different key than the original. When working with Michael Jackson's version, I didn't do any of this in particular, but this is something that I had to do for the purpose of this tutorial. I feel like there's some harmonies in the cover version that make it sound a little bit funky, but I think we just about got it here. So with that said, let's move on to the next step, which is the drums. So the first thing that I'll normally do once I have the vocal isolated and time stretched so that it is going to work in the tempo of the remix that I am working on is first run it against some drums to make sure that it's going to be in the right vibe of the remix. So right now I have something I've been calling Drum Loops 2.0. If you want to know a little bit more about that, there will be a link above that will take you to the breakdown for the remix of Lizzo's About Time, where I go into that in more depth. But first, let's take a listen to the vocals along with the drums. We're kind of listening in context to make sure that everything is singing together nicely. Awesome, so that definitely works. And just a quick run through of the drums. It's pretty simple, 4 on the floor drum pattern here, that house kind of vibe. And the idea is it's all using MIDI, so it's triggering the individual one hits. And since it's MIDI, it's easy to change any of these patterns easily. And since it's using Ableton's drum racks, it's easy to change any of the samples out as well at any point in time. So that's kind of why I've been calling it Loops 2.0, since it allows you to have a lot more flexibility, but you still get that quickness. So the idea is, since we can hear the vocal in context with the drums, we know that this song is worth pursuing because it's working in that higher tempo. Sometimes it can kind of sound too pitchy and too weird, or like chipmunky, or too low. So sometimes it won't work. So it's good to hear it in context with the main drum beat of the solid music that you're doing, so that it passes the vibe check and you can keep going. If you want to see a detailed breakdown again, you definitely check out that video. I think this one's a little bit different. There's a few more of these top loops layered over in this particular example. Kind of little, very subtle stuff like this, where it's almost more, just almost kind of more disco-y is kind of what I was going for. Very subtle stuff. A lot of these patterns are very similar to that other track. And then also something that I didn't show in that first tutorial is a look at the drum bus. So I'll quickly show you that as well, because that's interesting and was not shown before. Basically, the idea is all of these individual drum tracks are then being routed into this group track called drums. What we'll do is turn everything off so you can hear what it sounds like without it and then with it. So here are the drums without any of the processing. A little flatter. So the first thing is adding in some glue compression. What I did was started with one of the presets called Catch Peaks, then dialed the threshold up a bunch. And the idea is you can kind of visually and use your ears a bit to hear. Once it's about 2 to 3 decibels of gain reduction, and you're going for a lot of subtlety here. So that's the main idea. So just a small amount of pumping here, very, very subtle, just kind of gluing everything together. Then it's going through this tape bus here. Very similar idea here too. Kind of want it to be hitting at around 0. You can go over a little bit if you'd like to, but that's the main idea there. Then it is going into this Oxford limiter, which honestly, I just got this setting from a Disclosure live scene. It just adds a little bit of I don't know, just a little magic basically. Then there's just a bit of EQ8 taking out the tiniest bit of the low end, and then some of this like 186 hertz, which is just something that kind of sounded a little bit muddy to my ears. And then lastly, it's going through a color limiter just so that getting rid of some of the peaks, so there's a nice even volume throughout the entirety of the drums, which makes things a little bit easier to mix with later down the line. And that is the drums. So now let's go ahead and take a look at the bass. So now let's take a listen to the bass in context with the rest of the drums and the vocals. So it's a little bit more complex. I was kind of going for that like kind of skippy minimal house vibe that's a little bit more current right now. And so looking at the MIDI file, it's definitely a little bit complex, but the more we break it down, we'll see it's not too bad. So one of the first things I want to point out too is that over here, what I've done is I've set the scale to F sharp minor, which is one of those first steps that we were doing when we were extracting the vocals, so that we don't have to do as much guesswork when we're trying to figure this out. And the main thing is when I was working with this particular track, usually what I'll do is I'll have just one note kind of playing the root note of the key to hear how that sounds, and then move from that slowly. So the idea is to start on a simple one note, kind of pedaling that one note, and then evolve it. When I was doing that, I noticed that for me, it just sounded nicer using A as kind of the main note of the song. And usually what I'll do too, so if you're looking at all this, it obviously looks very complex, but usually what I'll do is just start one bar at a time. So if we almost zoom in just to here, and if you look from just bar one right here, this is what that sounds like. So it's just kind of bouncing around a little bit, mostly playing off of these like 16th notes here. And the idea is to kind of create one pattern, and then the idea is to duplicate it over and then make some small adjustments. So let's see if we can listen to that. So in this particular bass line, you can see the main thing I was doing was pedaling on this A. So it's constantly returning back to the A, and then it's usually bouncing between the A and this C sharp. And you can see the same thing kind of happens here. It goes back to the A, goes to the C sharp, a little bit from the G sharp and the F sharp, and then again it's going back to that A, bouncing between the A and the C sharp. And that's kind of the main idea and the kind of the main theme of the bass line here. And just like with each bar, I'd make some slight adjustments to make it a little bit more unique and sound a bit different from each of the bars, but it's mainly the main key here, subtly, until we get kind of this like last part here where things change a little bit. Instead of pedaling on the A, it does go to that F sharp, which is meant to be the key of this song, and then it goes back into A before looping back around. So that's kind of the idea of how I was writing the bass part. In terms of the sound, I was going for a similar sound that I usually go for, which is starting off with a sub sound. So if we listen to it now on its own first, just the sub. So I think that's pretty tight. Basically what I'm using is this cool little free patch that I got from Seed to Stage, which is a really cool YouTuber, and basically it's called Subs You Can Hear. It's mostly just a standard sine wave bass sound, but it adds harmonics using distortion and saturation to create that kind of upper mid sound that is going to push through on laptop speakers, phone speakers, those kinds of things, so that you can actually hear some of the bass, but it still has that core sine wave deep sub. It's going through a bit of processing, shaving off some of the highs and having some pumping on this kind of one knob sidechain little rack that I built here, and then a bit of EQ, getting rid of some of the lows and shaping out some of the mids, because what I'll do is I'll add in another MIDI track, and instead of like copying the whole MIDI file over into this track, what I'll simply do is set the monitoring into in, and then set the input, instead of all ins, I'll set it to the subs. So the MIDI is actually getting routed not just to this track here where it's playing this Subs You Can Hear preset. By doing this, the MIDI is also going into this second MIDI track here, so that I don't need to copy and paste it over. It's just automatically going in. And then over here, what I have is this bass guitar sample that I've built out and cut out a bunch more of the lows. So this one's cut at 200 hertz. So the idea is that a lot of the weight, the bass, is coming from this sub track, and then more of the mid character sound is coming from this bass guitar. So if we hear it together, you can get an idea of what it sounds like. So if you can hear it, the bass guitar is just adding a lot more of that like mid and high end, and then it's actually running through a very similar chain to the drum bus, where it's going through a little bit of glue compression, again just like hitting for like 2 to 3 decibels. Same thing going into the tape, hitting it a bit harder so there's a bit more saturation, again going through that kind of magic Oxford inflator, shaping it a little tiny bit, getting rid of a bit of the lows and getting rid of that like lower mid-range with some EQ8, adding in a bit more saturation, and again hitting with that color limiter, so it's cutting off some of the peaks, so there's more consistent audio from the bass, so it makes it again just a little bit easier when you're doing your levels with mixing. Usually the first big melodic thing I'll do is the bass, since you can kind of be just pedaling off of a couple notes. There's really, as complex as it may look, there's only like 3 or 4 notes that are really being hit here. And it's starting off pedaling off of just that one note, so it makes it a lot easier to make sure that the bass line that you're writing is sounding nice and harmonic with the vocal track. And then that way, when we move to the next step, which is adding in all of this extra melodic element like chords and pads and all that, it gets a little easier because we've kind of identified some of the notes that we know work, and then as we're stacking notes together with chords and whatnot, it'll get a little easier because we've done some of the groundwork and really confirmed where we want to head in terms of the harmonic content. So with that said, let's jump into that. All right, so now let's take a listen to all of the melodic content that I've built up around this track just on its own. So it might sound a little bit complex, but there's just a bunch of different layers here, and the main idea for almost all of this is it's all call and response. So there'll be one element that maybe does like one chord, and then another chord will come after it. Instead of layering them on top of each other, it's slightly offset or hitting like a different rhythmic point, so that way they're bouncing off each other, kind of a call and response. And that's really the biggest thing here. It happens a lot in the drums as well, but big time over here in the melodic side of things. So we'll kind of just go through this one by one. We're going to look at this little group here that we have called stabs. So what we'll do is listen to each of these right here, these 4 here, and you can see this is really what I was talking about with that call and response. We have this one first happening, and then we have this other one playing right after it, and then this one coming in, slowly swelling into it as well. So let's listen to these stabs just on their own so we can hear how they're kind of bouncing off of each other. So it's quite pretty, and essentially all it is I was just going through Splice, and since I knew that the song was an F sharp minor from the kind of research that we've done and the confirming it by building a bass line around it, I was able to just find a bunch of different cool sounding chords and then just kind of added them in here wherever I saw fit. And they're kind of following a pretty similar pattern, just like playing on the one here, the next one's playing on the one here. And then one thing that I should mention too is that everything I'm running through, like there's a bit of processing going on each of these tracks. It's usually just cutting out some of the lows, maybe cutting out some of the highs, and then adding a little bit of side chaining, just kind of going to the kick. But one of the main things that allows all these different elements to kind of connect together is that they're all running through these returns here. So I have a reverb that is set up like this. And so all of the elements are getting dialed in some amount of the same reverb. And since they're all going to the same reverb, it kind of puts them in the same space and makes them sound like they were recorded in the same room to an extent. And the same idea really happens there, where they're all getting routed in a little bit to this kind of shorter reverb as well. There's a longer reverb as well. And then there's a modulation, so a bit of chorus here, just like a classic Juno chorus, as well as a return track for some saturation. So since they're all kind of routing a little bit to some reverb, a little bit to some delay, a little bit to the same chorus, a little bit to the same saturation, it allows them to kind of glue together and sound like they're in the same vibe. So let's continue to add in some more of these elements. The next one that we will add in is this thing I've been calling the vocal swell, which I think is kind of a characteristic part of the overall vibe. So it starts off almost like that little vocal thing, and then the second half, like, I don't know if this is like a faux pas or something, but there's 2 different types of samples being used here. So there's the vocal one, and then more of this little jazzy, strummy guitar part. So let's keep adding in some next things. We have some of these very light little faint strum, kind of little bit of guitar bit that's added in here. If you can hear that. Quite nice. We got a bit more going on with these funky stabs. It's all really subtle, slowly adding up together. And when it comes to some of these larger loops, generally what I like to do is try to kind of cut them up. So I'm kind of chopping them up and having that call and response idea. But every once in a while, it is nice to just throw in a loop that works nice. And something that I will do is there's different effects that you can throw on. There's one called Tantra. So I'll go ahead and just unfreeze this so you can have a look at what that looks like. So this is a pretty cool little plugin. It's almost like a little sequencer built into it, and it'll add in different effects. And you can dial it in with the mix knob and just give it a little bit more character. So you're not just dropping in the loop on its own. You're adding in a little bit of your own vibe. So that's something that was added to that one, as well as the funky stabs. Tantra is on there too. And then let's keep adding these in. We also have this pick guitar kind of idea. Very subtle. This one has 2 of the tantras on it. And then let's keep moving. We have aqua echoes. So this one has been cut up and then consolidated. And then moving on, I did actually add in some chords here, and this is a dub kind of chord, so we'll listen to it as on its own. So pretty nice. Let's unfreeze it. Basically what's going on is it's just an FM patch. It's going through this auto filter. And what it's doing is it's using a bit of the envelope. So when that chord hits, it's going to push up the filter a little bit. I wish it had a visualizer for this, the auto filter enabled in, but it doesn't, unfortunately. And then also what we're able to do is we have the LFO inside of auto filter set so that it's at this rate here. This is also adding some movement to the filter, which is kind of giving it that like almost like auto wah kind of effect. Super cool. It's going into some tantra. It's very subtle as well. Then it's removing some of the high end. It has that echo and a little bit of pumping and getting rid of some of the low ends. There's actually quite a bit going on for such a subtle sound. It's also going into Portal, which is a really neat granular delay plugin. And I think that's a lot of what's adding in that the second coming of this sound. So the first chord hits and there's a bit of delay, and then there's a resurgence of it, which is mostly coming from that Portal effect right there, which is really nice. It's very similar to Crystallizer, if you're familiar with that plugin. Love that one as well. And then just a few more things to go through. There's this little whistle lead, which is just played in. Pretty cool. It's just a preset in Ableton, and then it's also using this cool vector delay with a preset called Whistle Delay, which is adding in a little bit of that weird kind of echoey, interesting kind of character. So it's all basically just a combination of all these small, subtle elements bouncing off of each other and adding in small layers that together give it a more complex vibe overall. And so one thing that I really like about this is, since all of the drums and the bass line and all of this harmonic content is all original, has been created originally, what we're now able to do in this instance is obviously we could finish this and have a finished remix of the song Billie Jean, which I think we'll have a link in the description to the full version of Billie Jean that I made with this, with the original Michael Jackson singing in it. But then one of the coolest things that you can do is you can just go ahead and, if you silence the vocal track, since you're not using any of the original instrumental or anything like that in the whole composition that you've created, you now have an instrumental track that you can use as the bed for your own original. So let's listen to it now without the vocal track. So it sounds pretty cool on its own. So the idea now is, since you're able to build up this song around that remix vocal kind of idea, you probably are going to create something a little bit more unique than you would have if you were just trying to do this on your own. Like, I don't think I would have came to this conclusion if I started with this process not building it around that vocal track. So now what you're able to do is then look for other opportunities to replace that vocal with a different hook. So what I have here is a couple different things I found from Splice, two different kind of vocal ideas. Just kind of cut them up here and have them again, if you can kind of even just follow the waveform, and you'll hear it in a moment. But again, it's kind of doing that call and response. So the first track really comes in heavy here, then the second vocal comes in as a response. Then again, that first vocal comes in, and then the second vocal comes in as a response. So let's go ahead and listen to what it sounds like with this new kind of vocal hook to make it end up being a completely original track. So definitely not as catchy and iconic as the Billie Jean idea, but it's still kind of a cool way, because now by doing something like this, and in terms of some of the processing, there's not too much going on here. Some sidechain, getting rid of the lows, getting rid of the highs, sending some of it to the returns, reverbs, delays, all that kind of stuff, so that this new idea is fitting in with the rest of the track naturally, because it's kind of going through the same processing, even though it came in way later and wasn't the original idea. That's kind of the beauty again of those return tracks. Hello again. So now you should have a solid idea of how you can extract a vocal from any recording that you'd like to, then build a remix around that nicely isolated and extracted vocal stem, and then how you can remove that vocal stem to then replace it with your own hook, so that you can actually have an original piece of music that you can actually release to the world if you'd like to. If you'd like to isolate or extract stems yourself, make sure you visit LALAL.AI or the link in the description. You can actually extract a bunch of other things other than vocals if you'd like to. It's a pretty powerful tool, so definitely check it out. With that said, I've been Matt from Best Friends Club. You've been the best, and I'll see you in the next video, my friend. Have a good one.